Hi, I'm Pat Kiernan. This is Pat's Paper as we go through the headlines of newspapers across the nation each weekday morning. Here's some of what we found on this Tuesday. The headline and the lead story in the New York Times is very blunt this morning. No early end seen to all-out war on Hamas. That phrase, all-out war, comes from Israel's defense minister, Ehud Barak. The Times noting that there is no active diplomacy in the fighting between Israel and Hamas, with the Palestinian death toll now over 350. Coverage in the Washington Post says Palestinian fighters sent dozens of rockets flying deep into Israeli territory. One of Israel's stated objectives is to end the ability of Hamas fighters to fire those rockets. Israeli journalist Gershom Gorenberg, writing a piece picked up by the LA Times this morning, the opinion there is that this use of force in Gaza has been in no one's interest. It's the field trip of a lifetime. Two California students traveled to West Virginia with their teacher to meet 107-year-old Frank Buckles. He is the last surviving American veteran of World War I. The San Francisco Chronicle says the students are producing a class documentary on the war. Buckles was 16 years old. He lied about his age to enlist in the U.S. Army in 1917. He greeted his high school visitors by simply saying, "I've lived a long time." In Alaska, the happy end to a pregnancy that got a lot more attention than the young parents bargained for. Sarah Palin's daughter had a baby boy. The disclosure came during her campaign as John McCain's running mate in the presidential race. The Alaska governor's 18-year-old daughter, Bristol, named her boy Trip. Coverage appears in papers across the country, including the Boston Herald, which tells us the child weighed 7 pounds 4 ounces. Governor Palin's office had little to say on the birth, calling it a private family matter. To Mexico, where there has been a remarkable turnaround in the air quality in Mexico City. The Miami Herald reports on the city that had the worst air in the world in a 1992 survey. Mexico City has since slashed its worst emissions by 3/4. The air still isn't great, in part because of altitude and mountains that prevent good airflow, but now the city is ahead of Beijing, Cairo, New Delhi, and Lima. The election result is in from Bangladesh, a landslide victory for an alliance led by former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. That brings a return to democracy in Bangladesh after 2 years of military-backed rule. The voting on Monday was the most peaceful in decades. Interesting story on page 1 of the LA Times about Stillwell Road, the story written by an unnamed correspondent working in Burma. The road was built in World War II as a supply line between the Western Allies and China. More than 1,100 American troops died building the road through Burma. The Times says that long-abandoned road may finally be reopened to promote trade between China and India. A team of marine mammal experts managed to free a whale this weekend off the Florida coast. The Washington Post among the papers following this story. The whale became tangled in fishing lines during its annual migration. This is a right whale, a species that numbers only 300 or 400. They were pushed to near extinction because they float when they're harpooned, and that made them an easy catch. The Philadelphia Inquirer carries a story that's in most every U.S. paper today. Congressional Republicans are objecting to the rush to consider President-elect Barack Obama's economic stimulus proposal. A more methodical process favored by some Republicans would compromise Obama's goal of having the $850 billion bill in place within days of taking office. USA Today with news about the economy. It's about the number of people who thought they were getting a deal when they locked in their home heating oil contracts for the entire winter. They did these lock-ins weeks or months ago. The story says they are feeling buyer's remorse as they watch the oil price plummet. For the most part, these contracts are valid. That means the homeowners have little choice but to pay the higher price. Next to that story, an interesting snapshot on Americans and religion. USA Today says in 2003, 90% of Americans surveyed said they believe in God. That number's down to 80% now. 73% believe in heaven, yet only 62% believe in hell. George Bush will end his presidency in unpopularity on many issues, but a front-page news analysis in the LA Times says his administration has triumphed in its legal defense of tactics used in the war on terror. Activists have had little success in recent years, challenging the domestic surveillance program to intercept phone calls or the practice of keeping suspects in military custody without filing charges. We're getting ready for the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. Brad Bradley will be on the sidelines again this year. The Dallas Morning News profiles the photographer who has worked that game for the past 61 years. He will be at the Cotton Bowl with a bag full of film. The 86-year-old says he hasn't made the transition yet to a digital camera. A front-page story in the New York Times says a down housing market has put a twist on many divorce cases. Couples are arguing over who doesn't get the house. A Moody's estimate says 1 out of every 6 homes in the U.S. is worth less than the mortgage on it. Divorce lawyers say some couples have decided to stay together because if they had to cash out of their house, they'd have nothing left with which to start over. Finally, to the Chicago Tribune, the story says, a note handed to a Fifth Third bank teller Friday was clear enough. Give your cash or I'll shoot. And then the report says, it was even clearer to investigators that they were not dealing with a criminal mastermind. That robber's note was written on the back of his own pay stub. FBI spokesman Ross Rice says, it is unusual that we see something that stupid. And that's a look at just some of what's in the newspapers this morning. We try to pick the highlights for you each day, but if you think there's a particular story we should have included, send us a comment. You can do that at patspapers.com, and there you will find links to the individual newspaper websites where you can read these stories in their entirety.